I believe that you mentioned that one of the problems that claimants have is that records have been purged after a certain number of years. Do you know if that's a policy, or is that just local custom, or what regulates when records are purged, and how can we change that so that there's more evidence that would be persistent?
Well, there are some records that are still purged and some that are no longer purged, thanks to the last National Defense Authorization Act, and perhaps Congresswoman Pingree can add to that. But sexual assault, I believe it's unrestricted reports are kept for 50 years. It may be restricted reports. What's still destroyed, however, is EO or sexual harassment investigations. So if you were sexually harassed and reported it, and this happened to me, I could tell you my firsthand experience. Those EO reports are destroyed within 2 to 5 years, and it's done branch to branch. I served in the Marines, so the Department of the Navy is not tracking those. We're not keeping those copies forever.
So there's no policy with regard to keeping those.
Not for sexual harassment investigations.
Well, you concluded in your testimony that when we look at the VA's policies on paper, it's no surprise that veterans who suffer from MST-related PTSD have only a 1 in 3 chance of having their claims approved. Could you please elaborate on that conclusion and how the VA regulations could be changed to improve the outcomes of that?
Sure. It's an absolutely murderous process. I mean, we heard the example of one veteran who killed himself because of this process, but I went through it myself. It took 4 years, and frankly, VBA is inept at the regional office level. I mean, you can give them all the evidence you have. I had plenty of eyewitness statements. I mean, everything they asked for, all this sort of secondary evidence that's in the regulation, but it was flat out ignored. And what happens when those claims get rejected is a lot of veterans fall into this downward spiral of worsening trauma. Ideation, suicidal ideation, maybe attempted suicide, maybe completed suicide. And so, I mean, we're looking at really a life and death situation here with this claims process. So and we don't need, it's not rocket science. We don't need to rewrite, it's not an issue of allowing more evidence. It's requiring less evidence. It's a very simple fix. We should have one universal standard for PTSD claims. Right now, lay testimony is not enough for sexual trauma survivors, but it should be, in addition to the other requirements for all PTSD claims. A doctor's diagnosis or a mental health provider's diagnosis. In your opinion, does it more have to do with the regulations or with the culture? It's both. I mean, unless there's a formal change in policy written in the regulation, you're counting on the individual regional officer, right, the claims pusher, claims provider, to make a judgment about whether or not a VHA diagnosis or a mental health provider's diagnosis of PTSD is accurate or enough based on their years of experience doing rape crisis counseling work or sexual trauma counseling work. And essentially what happens is VBA gets to deny the expertise of its VHA experts or mental health professional experts. It's a completely backward system. And unfortunately, you're right, there's bias within each individual claims officer who rejects these claims. And we can't risk that bias. A fix to this regulation is very simple. Okay, well, that's a good segue into Ms. Pingree's bill, H.R. 930. Do you think the provisions in this bill would help the veterans affected by MST in facing the hurdles that they have? Ms. Bhagwati? Yes, absolutely. I think H.R. 930 is a comprehensive solution that includes, not just post-traumatic stress, but all the other mental health conditions associated with sexual trauma. Not everyone has PTSD from sexual assault, rape, or harassment. I mean, other common conditions are other anxiety disorders, depression, and those are also life-threatening. Survivors will universally talk about the bias in the system within DOD and the bias specifically within the chain of command. And so, one of the reasons we have such a high underreporting rate is because of that bias, because of that fear of retaliation. And it's not just fear of retaliation, but actual retaliation, which very often happens. And so, here again, we're just talking about the 13 some odd % that actually report and whose evidence can then, if it's not destroyed, actually be used for a VA claim. But VA's responsibility now has to be to the entire percentage of survivors, including those 87% who do not report for very good reasons, for fear of their lives many times. So in order to do that, I mean, if you really want to go deep, there's got to be a change to the military judicial system so that there's no bias in that chain of command, and that's a longer conversation.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Let's thank the gentleman, and the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Walls, is now ready.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, the ranking member, and thank you for once again holding important hearings on substantive matters and trying to make things right. I'm very appreciative of that to both of you. And to our witnesses, thank you for helping educate us, helping bring it forward. As you do, I have such deep emotions on this as a retired military person that the anger and the disgust and the frustration all boil up on how do we end up in this point? It's just hard for me to fathom units that allow this to happen, and I recognize that it does, and I think us dealing on the VA side, and I think Ms. Bhagwati brought up a very good point that it has to be dealing with all 100% of folks here. Let's figuring that out, but we have to go back to the DOD side. We've got to figure out the prevention measures too, and I know Ms. Pingree and Ms. Spear have worked heavily on this, that we have to continue to push that side of it. As we're on this end and dealing with the after the fact and the tragedy that's there, I think many of you brought up really good points how we get there. If you were all three had the magic wand and were sitting over there at VA's position on this, what exactly would this look like, how we would deal with this? What exactly would happen from when the claim comes in and how we would go forward? What would be your suggestion if you can help me as we're going to hear from them? And I certainly know that we have we're trying to train specific raters to deal with this so they know what's there. I'm just trying to get a feel from all of you. Are they going about this the right way? Are we approaching it? Are we piecemealing together? What would you tell me? I know it's subjective here, but I think this is too important for us not to figure out something big to go about it. So if you'd like to take a stab at that, of what a claim should look like and how we should adjudicate these things that would be in the best interest of our service members after the fact. So please go ahead.
So I'm beating a dead horse here, but this is, I think, the third time I've said it. It's a very easy fix. If the evidence establishes a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress during service and the veteran's mental health provider connects that claimed stressor to the patient's service, then in the absence of clear and convincing evidence to the contrary, and provided that the claimed stressor is consistent with the circumstances, conditions, or hardships of the veteran's service, the veteran's lay testimony should sufficiently establish the occurrence of the claimed in-service stressor.
Ms. Bhagwati, are you convinced that will bring those 87% forward?
Absolutely. You trust your mental health providers, and you accept the lay testimony and the military record of the veteran, period.
What's the pushback of why we don't do that, in your opinion?
It's rape mythology, sir. It's this sort of unspoken feeling that women make up that they were raped, assaulted, or harassed. And I say women specifically because I think there is a gender bias.
It does go back to the bigger cultural, both military and social.
Absolutely. It's a complete ignorance about the nature of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment.
Don't you believe, and I've always believed this, the military has the potential to break those and set the precedents for a larger society, too?
Absolutely. The military can lead the way if it wants to.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that.
I think generally the VA is doing a good job providing counseling and treatment to victims of MST, but when it comes to awarding benefits, as we've heard so much already today, MST survivors face tremendous roadblocks and bureaucratic red tape. Since most attacks, as we've heard, go unreported, it's very hard for victims to provide the documentation during their claims, and therein lies some of the source of our problem here. The current policy states that they will be very liberal in deciding MST cases and should accept secondary markers as the proof that the assault occurred. Things like counseling reports for PTSD from MST, letters from family members citing behavioral changes, drug and alcohol abuse. But it has been our experience in my office that this policy is not being followed. The VBA remains vastly inconsistent when deciding on MST cases, and what one regional office accepts, as we heard earlier, accepts as a secondary marker, another might deny and still not be violating VBA policy. I think we have to be sure that VBA gives MST survivors the benefit of the doubt, especially when so many of these survivors have lost faith in the system they swore to uphold. That's why I introduced the bill that you were asking about earlier, and I appreciate that Chairman signing on to that bill. Basically, it would provide service connection for MST survivors if they provide a diagnosis of PTSD and a medical link stating that the PTSD is caused by the assault, similar to the policy now in place for combat-related PTSD claims. I want to be clear about this. The bad guy in these stories are the perpetrators. They're the villains and the ones who should be held accountable. But by creating this policy that denies justice to the victims and forces them to spend years or even decades fighting for the benefits that they deserve, we're deepening the wounds for those veterans and making it much harder for them to get on with their lives. Ms. Bhagwati, thank you very much for your wonderful work and being here today, and thank you to everyone on the panel. A couple of questions. You've already talked a little bit about this very issue of the VBA and how it's working. Do you think it's enough to ease the PTSD evidentiary burden for MST claimants, or do you think we also need to ease the burden on other common conditions associated with MST, like depressive disorders and other anxiety disorders?
As I said in my testimony, according to the Veterans Affairs Department, PTSD is the most common mental health condition associated with MST, but depressive disorders, other anxiety disorders can be just as life-threatening, and we certainly know that from the rest of the veterans community. I mean, there are many combat veterans are also suffering from depression rather than post-traumatic stress. So. No, it's not enough just to focus on PTSD. I mean, we have veterans committing suicide every day from major depressive disorder and other very, very serious conditions and very common conditions.
Ms. Bhagwati, you also mentioned that rape mythology, when you talked about this earlier, and the VA's fear of fraud. It's my impression that fraud is likely to be low in a situation like this. As you've reported and others have, very few people come forward to talk about a rape, a sexual assault, a sexual harassment because of the implications of doing that. But can you talk a little bit about that, since that's one of the reasons that we understand we don't have a better process here? Is there data to back it up, or how can we sort of get rid of the mythology here?
Well, the VA, interestingly, had the same concerns when it was debating whether or not to change the regulations related to combat, and then, the language ended up being about fear of hostile military or terrorist activity, but the VA had that discussion after the regulatory change and decided there wouldn't be any other false allegations or false claims as a result of this regulatory change, and I think the same thing can apply to this MST change. We've looked through VA claims data. What often happens as a result of these mistakes at the first kind of rejection phase is that the veteran, if they can tolerate it, will appeal, and ultimately, after a very, very lengthy appeals process, or the very end of the phase, VA will reverse the decision and end up sort of siding with the veteran, but that can take years, if not decades. And so, why not just get it right the first time and give the veteran the benefit of the doubt and just simplify the system? I mean, according to the FBI and numerous other agencies and studies, only 2 to 8%, again, 2 at the low end, 8% at the high end of rape allegations are so-called false allegations. That's a very low percentage. So I would like to think that VA is rooting for the 92 to 98% of rape and assault survivors that are telling the truth and who have investigations that can prove that they're telling the truth. That's all that means. It's a very low percentage, and it's pretty much on par with other crimes, with other false allegations.